We are back with Countdown to Kickoff. Conrad Van Order, Damian Mitchell, Molly Robinson holding things down for us here as we get ready for the biggest weekend of the college football season so far, Damian. But first, we want to thank our sponsors, River Distilling Company. They are located down in Birmingham. You can visit them on 7th Avenue South, 2400 7th Avenue South. And not only are they a full-service bar, but they also have a full-service kitchen, and they also are an event venue. So anything that you could need there, whether it's their handcrafted cocktails, all of their ingredients, all of their alcohol made by hand at the distillery. It is all homemade, all fresh. They have wonderful menu options, pretty much everything that you could possibly want, from appetizers, burgers, salads, all of that good stuff, as well as an event venue for your next event. So give them a visit. River Distilling Company, located there in Birmingham at 2400 7th Avenue South. All right, Damian, with that out of the way, let's just go ahead and dive into this matchup. Of course, Georgia coming down to Tuscaloosa to take on Alabama, a top 5 matchup. The first Alabama-Georgia matchup featuring Kirby Smart, but no Nick Saban on the other sideline. Gonna be that, I think that's going to play an interesting role in this game, is the mental side of things, because you have to imagine for Kirby and Georgia, you want to show that, okay, maybe we did trip up when we were facing Nick Saban, but now that Nick Saban's gone, we are here to kind of plant our flag as that dominant team in the SEC, as they've shown they can be over the last few years. But I think this would really cement that. And of course, for Kalen DeBoer, I mean, talk about winning over a fan base. He's already done, it feels like, everything right so far, but we know how the Alabama fan base is, and if Alabama were to lose this game, it will be interesting to see how that reaction comes for Kalen DeBoer. But on the other side, if he does win, this could set up to be a very special inaugural season for Coach DeBoer down there in Tuscaloosa. But diving into the matchup, Damian, just kind of how you see this one playing out, and maybe something on both sides of the ball that you think will be a focal point for both Alabama and Georgia that could ultimately decide who comes out victorious on Saturday night.
I really think it comes down to the quarterback play, because we've seen what Jalen Milroe has been so far early on in the Kalen DeBoer era. You can tell that he plays with a little bit more confidence than he did even last season. And he was confident in himself last year. And I think for Georgia, how far do you lean on Carson Beck? And I know the supporting cast is a little bit different. No Ladd McConkey, no Brock Bowers anymore, but okay, Dom Lovett, is he a bona fide number one guy? Is he a takeover guy, as opposed to what you see with Ryan Williams on the other side? And I think both offenses are kind of in the filling out process, because when you look at that Georgia-Kentucky matchup from a couple weeks ago, it looked like Carson Beck was human for the first time in a long time. And, shout out to Kentucky and how they played him defensively. But I think for Alabama, it's, all right, we've seen what the air raid kind of looks like with South Florida. They've seen the flavors of what it could be. Western Kentucky trying to throw it all over the yard. All right, well, now Georgia, they're going to try to line up and see where your bread is buttered right there in the trenches. And I think for Georgia, you have to establish something in the run game to really open up everything else for Carson Beck in the passing game. And for Alabama defensively, it's, all right, you're not going across looking at the Wisconsin receivers. This isn't the Western Kentucky guys. Like, these are, now you're at the cream of the crop of what the SEC is. And it's not like they're worried about anything. Malachi Moore has played 50 years of college football. Keon Sabb has played high-level college football. So they know what to expect as far as the athleticism side, and they're a little bit older too. I'm interested to see what that corner position is going to look like. I know these guys are a little bit young. I mean, you look at Dominic Jackson and what he's been able to do. He's played a lot of ball, but now you're going against some of the elite of the elite. And also, like you said, for Kalen DeBoer in his first big game, the first one, he just played for a national title with Washington, so I know he's not scared of the moment, but it's just going to be different now with Alabama being the representative of him and how his team is going to prepare. And I think they've done a good job up until this point of showing that they are a complete team on both sides of the ball. It's just, can you do this against the magnitude of the number 2 team in the nation?
Yeah, and I think you brought up an interesting point when you're talking about Georgia. And I think one of the big takeaways for me as I'm looking at this matchup and trying to figure out how I think it's going to play out is, I think this is the first time since, and I know it's only been, 2 or 3 matchups in between, but you go back to 2021 and that SEC championship game where Alabama beat Georgia, and then ultimately in the rematch, Georgia would win in the national championship. But that SEC championship game, when you had Jamison Williams and John Mechie, I think that was the last time you looked at this game and said, oh, Alabama has the better weapons offensively. Because in the national championship, you did have Jamison Williams, but he ultimately gets hurt in that game. Mechie had already gotten hurt at that point. And so you were really left with the Ajayi Halls of the world. And we, all have made enough jokes about that over the years. But, now you look at the last couple of years and what Georgia's had with the Ladd McConkeys and the Brock Bowers of the world. And now you don't have those guys. And you bring up, do you have that dominant receiver? Right now, it doesn't look like they do. It doesn't mean you don't have nice pieces in the Dylan Bells and Dominic Lovitz, but they just don't look like the game-breaking weapons that we've seen Georgia have in the past. Now, on the other side, you could say, well, maybe they're better at quarterback than they've been in some time with Carson Beck and the experience that he has now in his full second season as a starter. But I think that's going to be a big part of this game is if you're Alabama, you're going to want to stop the run, and that's been something that's been difficult for them. I would say that's probably the biggest weakness that we've seen from this Alabama team up to this point has been their run defense, and it just hasn't been great. And you're going to have a big test with that against Georgia. But I think if you are able to limit what ETN and some of those players can do in the running game, it's going to make things hard for Carson Beck because we saw Carson Beck struggle last year in this game against Alabama in the SEC title game. And a lot of that did come down to what Alabama was able to do to Georgia's offensive line and put pressure on Carson Beck. But if you're able to take that running game kind of out or limit it for Georgia and force Carson Beck to beat you, I think that's exactly where Alabama wants to be. And you brought up the secondary. You do have a lot of young guys. This is going to be a big test for them. But so far, the early results have been very good. You brought up Damani Jackson. He's only allowed 7 yards in coverage this season, the best in all of FBS. He's been absolutely sensational. And then you got your young guys like Damian Brown, who I think has really impressed early on. But granted, let's be honest, Alabama hasn't faced I would say they have not faced a good passing quarterback up to this point. Byron Brown was good with his legs in the USF game. And then, unfortunately, Tyler Van Dyke goes down with the injury against Wisconsin. So this is going to be a big test for them and a big step up. But I do think that when you just kind of break it down this way, I can understand why we've seen a lot of people kind of siding with Alabama going into this matchup. Now, something else that I want to talk about with this game is the implications of the winner and the loser. Because, again, 12-team playoff is here. Whoever loses this game, you're still right there in the thick of things. But what do you think it means both looking ahead to the college football playoff, but also just mentally for these programs after this weekend? What do you think a win does for the Alabama and then for the Alabama side of things and then the Georgia side of things in terms of maybe what their expectations are or what they expect for the rest of the regular season at least?
I think for Georgia, if you get this game, it kind of sets a nice domino effect of, okay, this team is still talented enough to win on the road in these big games because you look at the rest of their schedule, still got to take that trip to Texas. They got to take that trip to Ole Miss, and you feel a little bit more confident in that group if they find a way to beat Alabama moving forward. And you look for Alabama and the rest of their schedule, you get this one really outside of the third Saturday in October, you feel pretty confident of what this team could potentially do along as the rest of the schedule continues. And then you start looking at SEC championship potential, and then you look at the 12-team playoff. It could be going from a 1 seed to a 5 seed if you lose the ball game. It kind of one of those things where it's kind of figuring things out as far as where your placement is in the college football playoff. And like you said, to the 12-team, it kind of separates you almost a little bit because if you're Alabama, you get this one, you start to lose that sign of thinking, oh, they're missing Nick Saban and things. And Greg McElroy brought up a great point earlier in Mac and Cube that, Nick Saban hasn't played a snap of football in almost 40, 50 years. So the coach makes a difference, but I don't think it's that big of a difference of the fact that those players are still 5 and 4 stars that are playing. And the same way with Georgia on the other side. And for Kirby, is it psychological at this point that, okay, we've won multiple national titles, but we've also lost to Alabama multiple times. So at some point, you're either going to erase the notion of, oh, Kirby can't beat Alabama. And if he finds a way to do it, then it's like, okay, well, now they're trending in the right direction. Or for Alabama, it's rinse and repeat. Doesn't even matter who's on the sideline. And you see where the rest of this team is going to look like.
Yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot about both of these teams. I mean, they're clearly heavy favorites to make the college football playoff, but in terms of national championship expectations, because we know those are the expectations for Georgia and to a certain degree for Alabama. But I think if you are Alabama and you're an Alabama fan, if you win this game, I think maybe any skepticism you might have had about Kalen DeBoer and the staff goes out the window, and you are straight on the national championship or bust bandwagon, as we've come to expect for Alabama under the last 17 years of the Nick Saban tenure. And then if you're Georgia, I mean, even if you do lose, you still have, I mean, you've got Texas, you've got Tennessee, you've got Ole Miss. You have a lot left on your plate. I think Alabama can survive a loss to this a little bit easier than Georgia, just because I don't think their schedule is quite as difficult the rest of the way out. But it's the mental thing for Georgia and for Kirby Smart. And they have been the class of the SEC here over the last handful of years. They have the most national championships. But can you really stake your claim as the top dog in the SEC if you can beat up on everybody in the conference, but then when Alabama comes into town, it's kind of a completely different story. So this is the big one. We all can't wait for this game on Saturday down in Tuscaloosa. Kickoff at 6:30. Going to be arguably the biggest game of the entire college football season. But we have a lot of other things to talk about around the SEC. And, we got to talk about Auburn. They have a big game against Oklahoma this weekend. But is it a must-win game for Hugh Freeze after the start of the season for the Auburn Tigers? We'll discuss that next when we return right here on Countdown to Kickoff on JOX 94.5.
Welcome back into the JOX Countdown to Kickoff, presented by our friends at Dread River. Damian Mitchell alongside Conrad Van Order, Molly Robinson holding things down in production. We know the biggest game in the world pretty much on the weekend is Alabama,
Auburn,
Georgia.
Oklahoma.
No, it's definitely Alabama, Georgia.
Oh, okay.
And that's all good. But the second most important game in the state, of course, is the Auburn Tigers taking on the Oklahoma Sooners.
There it is.
Yeah, and for both teams coming back from a loss, there's a sense of desperation in both of these programs right now, and especially on the Auburn front, because within 4 games, you've already benched a quarterback. You put one in and his backup. You benched him. And now it's a quarterback battle going into Saturday as far as are we going to see Hank Brown? Are we going to see Peyton Thorne? And coming off of that loss from Arkansas, especially for Auburn, it's one thing to have said that Arkansas was just head and shoulders better than you. No, you had 5 turnovers. And that doesn't help no matter who you're playing against. And for as bad as Arkansas played and you still not being able to figure it all out, there's a sense of desperation for this Auburn unit going against this Oklahoma team who quite frankly, got beat the brakes off of by Tennessee, but we kind of expected it, a little bit lower scoring. But I do think defensively, you can see that this Oklahoma defense is legit.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that this Oklahoma defense is one of the better defenses in the country. It's just unfortunate for them that they played a team that has a better defense and a better offense than them in the Tennessee Volunteers last weekend. But, I'm with what you were saying about this kind of being a desperate moment for Auburn and the fan base and Hugh Freeze, quite frankly. This has the feeling of, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but it just feels like it would be the most Auburn thing ever to have the dud that you had against Arkansas last week and then come out this week and knock off Oklahoma at home. And to be fair, this is a game that going back to the offseason, I mean, a lot of us looked at this as kind of that turning point game for Auburn, right? As, we were all wrong, but we had all kind of assumed, Auburn's going to have a really good shot of being 4-0 heading into this football game. If they get this, they're definitely going to be in the top 25, and that's when we start getting into the, was 8 wins too conservative of a prediction for Auburn, and maybe they had that breakout season. But we know that's not how things have gone through the first 4 weeks for Auburn, at least. But this game is very winnable for them, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason for that is you're facing a freshman quarterback, a true freshman quarterback, making his first ever start, and he has to come into Jordan Hare. And we can say what we want about, New Mexico State, Cal, and Arkansas all coming in to the plains of Auburn and beating Auburn in their own stadium in the last calendar year. But that doesn't mean it's not a difficult place to play, and especially for an SEC game and a freshman quarterback who's going to have a lot of pressure on his shoulders after how bad the Oklahoma offense looked last week. I think that puts Auburn in a pretty advantageous situation to make his life pretty miserable out there, and for DJ Durkin to try to give him some new looks and things that he won't have seen on the film from Auburn's first 4 games, but also just things to throw him off because he's a young guy, right? And he doesn't have that experience. But I think on the other side, for Auburn, that's going to lead itself into being probably a lower scoring game. And while the defense for Oklahoma is one of the best in the country, I believe they have the best turnover differential in the country still after that Tennessee game. So they love to take the ball away. And as we know, Auburn loves to turn the ball over this year. So that could be a big factor. But if you're Auburn, I think it lends itself to you if it's a lower scoring game. And if you just run the dang ball, you're going to be able to control this game, I feel like, because if you can go and have an effective running attack and you're going up against a freshman quarterback, you can control and limit the possessions for Oklahoma. Unless we see something offensively that is the exact opposite of what they showed last week against Tennessee, if you're Auburn, you can probably win this football game scoring 20, 21 points.
Yep.
And I think that's a much more favorable matchup for Auburn, who, to be fair, when they haven't turned the ball over, have been pretty efficient offensively. It's just a question of what version of Peyton Thorne are we going to get on Saturday, because I think we all assume that he's going to be the guy. I think we would be shocked if Hank Brown walks out there as a starter. I mean, honestly, at this point, I don't know if many things would surprise me, but I think we all assume it's going to be Peyton Thorne, right, Damian, and based on what we saw in the second half last week, do you think that we get that version of Peyton Thorne for 60 minutes, or are we going to get something more akin to what we saw in the Cal game for 60 minutes? Or are we not even going to get 60 minutes of him and we're going to go back to benching guys and flip-flopping quarterbacks?
I don't know, because with Peyton Thorne, you literally just don't know what you're going to get. And we could go back to Alabama A&M to start the season off where it's like, wait a minute, if this Peyton Thorne is for Auburn, if this Peyton Thorne shows up for Auburn, by God, they are going to be tough to beat. And then you see Cal, and it's, okay, well, if you play that Peyton Thorne for the rest of the year, Auburn may not win another football game. Then New Mexico State rolls around and Hank Brown's in there. He's like, if we get this version of Hank Brown, Auburn may still have a puncher's chance. Then you saw both of them, and it's just yin and yang. But to me, I think if you're Peyton Thorne, man, you've played a bunch of football. You've played a bunch of football. We know exactly what you look like. But in my heart, I'm expecting it to be better. Like, I just have this optimistic look of, all right, big dog, you've already been benched. You've seen it. You came in the second half. You played loose, and you look good. You look better than you did even when you were starting. That one interception is not your fault. Receivers got to catch that. Cam Coleman's got to catch that. For as talented as you are and the expectations of what you could be with all that talent, yes, you got to make that play. But I think for Auburn, I agree with you. Just run the ball. Jarquez Hunter needs to be dog tired at the end of the game. He needs to be, to truly, truly make it easy for everybody else, because Jarquez Hunter last week, 12 carries. 12. In a game that was 7-0 at halftime. So it wasn't out of the...
And that's the part that killed me about the game last week, is you had people saying, well, but you're losing. You're trying to get back into the game. You're down by one possession.
One.
You need to score one time. You're not down 21.
And Auburn's offensive line is just, I mean,
they're not good.
They're not good.
They're not good.
And to me, in order for them to even have a semblance of trying to stop this Oklahoma offense or Oklahoma defense, you have to give them the threat of running the football. You have to establish the run game. And I think with Jarquez Hunter and Damari Alston, those guys back there, and even with Peyton Thorne, who's been able to utilize his legs, he's shown that he can run the ball as well. So the more ways that you can kind of limit those opportunities and kind of chew the clock a good little bit to limit what they can do on the offensive side for Oklahoma. Because, again, like you said, they're starting a true freshman. So DJ Durkin, if there's ever a time to light them up, this is the week. And you saw a little bit of that with Taylor Green and how inaccurate he was for Arkansas. So I can only imagine what it's like with a true freshman making his first start in Jordan-Hare. So I think when you look at both of these teams head to head, the only true separator I really think is just the quarterback consistency on pretty much both sides. It's all right if Peyton Thorne is the starter, he goes out there, just play above water, like just keep the game manageable, and if anything, try to find Keandre Lambert-Smith as many times as you possibly can.
And and I think that's one of the more frustrating things probably going into this game for Auburn fans, as you look at it and you say, as I talked about a few minutes ago, coming into the season, this was one of those pivotal games you looked at on the schedule for Auburn. But if you had told an Auburn fan a month ago or a month and a half ago, hey, when Oklahoma comes into town week 5, they're going to be starting a true freshman because Jackson Arnold wasn't good because he got benched.
Right.
I mean, the Auburn fans would be licking their chops thinking, there's no way that we're going to, possibly throw up on ourselves and give up this moment. But, that's where we are right now. And it really does come down to who can take better care of the football? Is it going to be the true freshman that can come in and play smart and just not turn the ball over? Or is it going to be Peyton Thorne potentially showing why Hugh Freeze doubled down and had all this confidence in him in the offseason? I will throw this stat out there and one more note on the running game and how important we both think this can be for Auburn. You look at the Tennessee game last week, and Dylan Sampson, who's one of the best running backs in the entire country so far this year, 24 carries for 92 yards and a touchdown. So he's averaging a little under 4 yards a carry. And I know you look at that and go, oh, well, it's 3.8 yards per carry. That's not the prettiest thing in the world. That's what you needed to do to win that football game last week. That's how Tennessee continued to keep the game out of reach for Oklahoma. And even though they only put up 25 points, I think we can all agree they kind of took their foot off the gas a little bit. And they were just trying, they were just, closing that thing out last weekend in Norman. If you're Hugh Freeze, I just don't want it to be a situation where you're looking at the play sheet or the stat sheet at halftime and going, all right, Jarquez has, 10 carries, but he's only, 4 yards a carry. Maybe we need to throw the ball more. You want to grind this thing out. And I want to see that from Jarquez. Like you said, I want to see that. I want him laying on the sideline after the game because he is so exhausted because he's been given the ball 25.
Yes.
Dare I say 30 times. That's not going to happen. But you get the point, right? You need to double down on the running game while you have this uncertainty at quarterback. And with the situation for Oklahoma's offense, I think that's the best way for you to win. That's the best way forward for Auburn in this offense. But we'll see if, Hugh Freeze continues to stick with the game plan and the play calling that, according to him, has been nearly flawless through the first 4 weeks of the season, or if they start to mix things up and, give the ball to their best player.
Yeah, the scheme is never the issue. Scheme is never the issue. Allegedly. His words, not mine. But here's the thing about Hugh Freeze and this Auburn team. You don't get 9 chances to play Oklahoma. You only get 1.
And so it goes.
Keep it locked right here on Jock's Countdown to Kickoff, presented by our friends at Dread River. We'll continue the conversation, take a look at Ole Miss and Kentucky, another game in the SEC that should probably be an interesting one. Keep it locked right here on Jock's 94.5. And all the pieces fall.
Welcome back in to Countdown to Kickoff. I don't know what that was, but that was Damian Mitchell. I'm Conrad Van Order. Molly Robinson holding things down for us here as we continue with our preview of Week 5 of the college football season. Of course, we already got to the big ones here in the state of Alabama. Obviously, Alabama, Georgia, the biggest game across the entire country this weekend in college football. And then Auburn looking to bounce back from their loss to Arkansas as they welcome the Oklahoma Sooners, making their first road trip in the SEC. Last week was their first SEC game, now their first SEC road trip. But we have a number of other matchups across the conference to get to, including Kentucky and Ole Miss, the biggest test for Lane Kiffin and those Rebels up to this point. But we do want to remind you that Countdown to Kickoff, we are brought to you by our wonderful friends at Dread River Distilling Company. And I think a lot of people, if you've heard of Dread River, you're familiar with their cocktails, their bar service. That's what they're known for mainly. But they also have a full service kitchen and a wonderful menu for you to choose from. They serve food each and every day of the week, and they actually change up their menu weekly to include new, fresh, seasonal ingredients as the year goes along. They do happy hour from Monday through Friday from 3 to 6 p.m. I'm always a fan of a good happy hour. They also have Whiskey Wednesdays, which offer you can get the Dread River burger and a beer, or a Dread River burger and a whiskey at a discounted price. They have so many wonderful options. They have orange chicken, steak quesadillas, appetizers, anything that you could possibly want, and all their ingredients made in-house there at Dread River Distilling Company. Go visit them at 2400 7th Avenue South in Birmingham. All right, Damian, looking at this Ole Miss Kentucky matchup, maybe not, maybe it doesn't jump off the page at you, right? Because I think we all expect that Ole Miss is going to handle their business, but I do think that seeing how Kentucky played against Georgia a couple weeks ago maybe makes this matchup a little more interesting, because let's be honest, Ole Miss really hasn't been tested up to any point in the season so far, and I'm still confident that they are one of the best teams in the country, but this is going to be the best defense that they've faced, and we know, let's be honest, Lane Kiffin is Lane Kiffin.
Yep.
So anything is always possible, but going into this game, Damian, do you see there being any chance for Kentucky to catch Ole Miss off guard and potentially pull off the upset as the Rebels have their biggest test of the season so far?
I think it's more of, as long as Ole Miss doesn't sleepwalk, I think Ole Miss handles their business. I think that from what we've seen from this Kentucky matchup, I don't think they're good enough offensively to find themselves in a shootout and feel confident that they can keep it within a certain number. And I got to give Ole Miss defense a lot of credit too. And they've improved a little bit. Like, it's crazy to think that a Pete Golden-led defense could look this good early on. But again, when you look at the competition that they played, and I understand there's still a talent gap, but I think offensively,
it's almost like the expectations for the defense are a little bit lower at Ole Miss than they were in Tuscaloosa.
Maybe so. A few pieces are a little bit different. But I think for Ole Miss offensively, if Jackson Dart keeps playing the way that he has been playing, Kentucky really has no shot. And I mean that respectfully, because I do think that they're talented enough, but there's such a gap in what they're able to do offensively. Okay, if we have to run the ball, we got plenty of guys back here that can do it. Ulysses Bentley, you look at what Parrish has been able to do in his second go around at Ole Miss, and this offense is just so fast. And I don't think there's a defensive back that Kentucky has right now that's going to be able to neutralize what they have in that receiving room. That is a different level. You look at Trey Harris, it seems like at least one play out of each game, he's on SportsCenter's top 10.
It's a highlight reel. Yep.
Exactly. And they're not going to be able to match up with those guys just pound for pound. So I think for Kentucky, in order to, I guess you would say, find a way to neutralize it a little bit, you're going to have to bring pressure and just bank on your secondary to hold on as much as long as they possibly can, because your front seven is going to have to disrupt what's going on for Ole Miss's offense. Now you flip it over to the defensive side of things. I'm not going to say this is great offense, because Kentucky doesn't really have an identity. Brock Vandagriff, you go back and watch South Carolina, you're asking, why is this guy even playing quarterback? And then you watch him against Georgia, it's okay, a few passes here and there, they win the ball game. And I don't know if the styles just match up too well for what Kentucky does. They're going to have to hit them in the mouth. And we had this conversation on Morning Jocks, which you can also hear from 6 to 7 on Jocks 94.5 as well every single morning. Brock Vandagriff is somewhere in between the peak of Will Levis as the Kentucky quarterback, not the Tennessee Titan quarterback, and also Devin Leary, which are the past two quarterbacks that they've had there at Kentucky. He's somewhere in the middle of that, because I don't think his ceiling is as high as Will Levis's was coming out of Kentucky, but his floor is not to the Devin Leary level. So he's somewhere in that mix where, all right, you can see pieces of, if he gets it together just a little bit, he could really improve this offense. And I think that, Dane Key, if he were anywhere else in the SEC, he's probably a number 2 guy, but he's your number 1. And you kind of look at how this offense goes through him at the receiving spot, that, okay, you're going to have to live and die with what 6 can give you. And I don't know if Kentucky's strong enough to be able to line up and just run the ball, chew the clock against this Ole Miss defense, because they made a lot of progression in the defensive line. And you think of Prince, I can't think of his last name.
I just call him Prince U.
Yeah, Prince U. I don't want to mess up his last name, but he's a dude. And you can tell. He looks physically a little bit different than the rest of what Ole Miss's defense has been in years past. And I don't know if Kentucky can just line it up and say, you know what, we're about to go foot to foot, run the power, run, trap and everything right there in front of you. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that. So it's going to take Ole Miss making some mistakes or kind of sleepwalking and being lackadaisical in some things in order for Kentucky to really, really make this a ball game.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're Kentucky, I think we know what their path to victory in these kinds of games is, right? Is you want to limit what the other team can do offensively and make it a knockdown drag out like you had against Georgia, where it was 14-13 was the final score in that one. And that's my thing with Ole Miss is quite frankly, I don't know if there's a defense in the country that's capable of keeping Ole Miss under, let's say, 21 points. And if you're Kentucky, you brought up the improvements that Ole Miss has made on defense, because they're kind of like, I think Tennessee's done a better job of it, but similar to Tennessee in the fact that defense was a real struggle for them. And you looked at what they were able to do offensively, but they were held back by their defenses. And then last year, Ole Miss definitely took a step in the right direction defensively, as did Tennessee. And now you're seeing this year, Tennessee legitimately might be the best defensive team in the country. Like that's a serious possibility. Ole Miss isn't quite there, but from compared to where they were, 3 years ago under Lane Kiffin to where this defense is now, they've taken huge strides forward with the Prince Hughes of the world, the Walter Nolans of the world, these guys that got through the transfer portal. And I just haven't seen anything from Kentucky that's going to lead me to believe that they're going to be able to outscore Ole Miss, even if they're able to hold Ole Miss to something like 21, 24 points. That would, I just don't see that happening. And I like throwing these out sometimes, these crazy stats. And this is a crazy stat for you. So listen carefully when I say this. Jackson Dart has over 1,000 more passing yards than Brock Vandegrift. Not Jackson Dart has over 1,000 yards passing on the season, which he does. He has 1,000 yards more passing than Brock Vandegrift. They played 4 games. Jackson Dart has 1,554 passing yards. Brock Vandegrift has exactly 550.
Wow.
Think about that. That is crazy. That's
insane.
That is an extra 250 yards passing a game for Jackson Dart versus what you've gotten from Brock Vandegrift. And I know that's not going to tell the entire story, but I think that's a pretty good representation of what this Ole Miss offense has done through 4 weeks versus what this Kentucky offense has done. And granted, you did have to play Georgia, whereas Ole Miss has been playing the Furmans and Wake Forest and MTSUs of the world. But still, I think we've seen enough, and we know Lane Kiffin well enough to understand that this offense is just going to be menacing regardless. And I think it's going to be a very difficult challenge for Kentucky and for Ole Miss. It's just a question of, are you able to sustain this offensive dominance and go out there and put up 40, 50 points every week, even when you're in SEC play, as opposed to playing some of these group of 5 teams or an ACC team like we've seen them do so far. But that's just one of the other SEC matchups that we have going on this weekend across the conference. You've also got Arkansas, Texas A&M, Texas, and Mississippi State. You got Texas this week. But we have some other games to catch up to. LSU with an intriguing matchup outside of the conference. Probably going to be a lot of points scored in that one, Damian. So we'll wrap up the rest of the action across the SEC in Week 5. You're listening to Countdown to Kickoff here on JOX 94.5.
Welcome back into the JOX Countdown to Kickoff presented by Dread River, Damian Mitchell, Conrad Van Order, Molly Robinson, all holding it down for you for a few more moments as we kind of do the wrap-up part of the SEC. We got, of course, we know the big game between Alabama and Georgia, Oklahoma and Auburn. You can smell the desperation through the speakers. You really can. And then, of course, Kentucky and Ole Miss. Can either one of them kind of figure it all out to see if Ole Miss is for real against a pretty good Kentucky team, or maybe Kentucky's just, we gave our best fight against Georgia, let the chips fall where they may from this point forward. But we do have a game that's kind of sneaking a little bit under the radar. It's a rivalry game with those fighting Texas Aggies taking on the Arkansas Razorbacks. Arkansas coming off of a big win against Auburn there in Jordan-Hare. Texas A&M surviving the Bowling Green matchup, and Texas A&M opens up as a slight favorite there in Jerry World. But to me, if you look at what Arkansas has been able to do these past 4 games on their schedule as opposed to what Texas A&M is, we have more of an identity with Arkansas. We kind of know what to expect. It's, can they put a full 4 quarters together of true dominant football and not shoot themselves in the foot? And for Texas A&M, you either rocking with Marcel Reed or you're going with Connor Wigman. But you have to make a decision for this team to move forward and just to see what this game is going to look like.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting part of this game going into it is, it seems like Wegman's going to be a bit of a game time decision there for the Aggies, but he was your starter coming into the year. I think coming into the year, we would have probably said he was in the upper half of quarterbacks in the SEC, but he just had to show that he could stay healthy. Unfortunately, not only has he not been able to stay healthy, he has played poorly when he has been out on the field. And I think what you saw from Marcel Reed a couple of weeks ago gave you a pretty good deal of confidence being able to go down to the swamp and handle Florida with a backup quarterback and a true freshman at that backup quarterback. But then you saw what happened against Bowling Green last week. And to Bowling Green's credit, they did the same thing they did to A&M to Penn State going back earlier in the season. So that's, a respectable opponent, but nonetheless, your Texas A&M, you should be able to go out there and beat them by more than a score of 26-20. And I think both of these teams are still just kind of trying to find what their identity is. I think Arkansas, they have a better idea. It's running the football. It's just trying to find that balance of how many times do you want Taylon Green to go out there and take the hits versus Jaquindon Jackson? Because they've both been spectacular running the football. It's been the accuracy for Taylon Green that's been the big issue going back to the win over Auburn and UAB as well. It was really his legs that were not only the reason he stayed in the game, but honestly the best things that Arkansas was doing offensively in both of those matchups. And so now coming into this game against Texas A&M, are you able to carry that over? And is Taylon Green able to show a little more consistency throwing the football? Because, you know, you have a really, really good receiver in Armstrong there on the outside for Arkansas. You have a great running back, and you have a very lethal quarterback with his legs. It's just, can you use that running game to open things up in the passing game and then capitalize on it? Because there are just so many throws these last 2 weeks that he's left out there on the field. But you go back to the Oklahoma State game, and he was making those throws. And so can he get back to doing the little things right so that he can be more consistent passing the football? Because let's be honest, the further you get along in an SEC slate, it's great that you can use your legs. But if you're completing under 50% of your passes consistently, your offense is going to be at the very least very, very limited. And then on the other side of that for Texas A&M, it's just, are you going to really sell or I guess kind of sell out on running the football? Is that going to be your main focal point? And I assume if Marcel Reed is the guy, that is going to be the focal point. But then if Connor Wegman comes back, it's how do you get him in a rhythm offensively? And how do you find somebody that can be kind of that go-to weapon for him on the outside? Because I think coming into the year, or, you know, when last season ended, you said, man, you have one of the best receivers in all of college football in Evan Stewart. Well, he's now in Eugene, Oregon, catching passes from Dylan Gabriel, so you don't have that luxury anymore. But this is a big turning point for both 3-1 teams as they head down and look ahead to what's coming up for them in their SEC part of the schedule. But yeah, this is going to be a big game. I think it might be a little sloppy, a little ugly at times.
Right.
But this is going to be a massive conference win for whoever comes out on top.
Yeah, and another SEC matchup, and you know, you feel for this team because they are in a very, very just peculiar situation because they didn't really find themselves or expect to see themselves in this position. That's Mississippi State, and now they got to, you know, you've already took that loss to Florida last week, which was probably your best chance of getting a win in the SEC.
Yep.
Now you got to go on the road to Texas, and
Texas is going to win by a lot.
Yeah, and there's kind of no other way to really describe it except that you are outmatched at every position, and Blake Shapen now is going to be done for the rest of the year. I mean, Van Buren Jr., he's good, but I don't think you're good enough to beat Texas, big dog.
No, and it's, you know, you feel for Mississippi State fans, but you go and you look at the last couple of weeks, and you weren't competitive at all against Toledo. They blew the doors off of you. And then last week against Florida, a bad Florida team that was desperate for a win. Credit to Florida for going out and playing pretty well, but, you know, you weren't particularly competitive in that game either. And so, you know, there's no reason for me to expect that now that you're playing Texas, and oh, by the way, you're going on the road to Austin, Texas to play this game. I think it's going to be ugly. I think the big thing for Texas is, you know, is Quinn Ewers healthy? And if he is, are you going to play him, or are you going to stick with Arch? Because I think we all know that, you know, that is not going to determine the outcome of this game.
Right.
Who's under center for Texas? It's just more of a question of, you know, how healthy is Quinn Ewers? I think that's going to be the big question for Texas fans, because this should be a walk in the park.
It should be. And to wrap up just the SEC slate, the late kickoff at 6:45, South Alabama takes the trip to Baton Rouge to take on LSU. And now no Harold Perkins on that defense, and that defense is already pretty shaky anyway. Now you're welcome in South Alabama, who scored probably, 400 points in the past 2 games, somewhere around there?
135, but yeah, that's close.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're Gio Lopez and Fluff Boutwell, this could be your shining moment of, hey, we're going to an SEC school. Our offense has shown that they can score against a defense that is not good. This may be the highest scoring matchup that we see, and it's coming from, you know, South Alabama and LSU.
Yeah, I think in terms of if you just want to watch a game, there's going to be a lot of points scored. This is probably the game for you. And I think especially with what we've seen LSU struggle with at times, which is running the football, you know, they kind of have to throw the ball. They kind of have to put it in Garrett Nussmeier's arms. And that, you know, that's going to lead to you scoring a lot of points. But it's also going to mean that it's more difficult for you when you're in these close games to be able to kill the clock and kind of control the pace of the game. But we know they want to go very, very fast. South Alabama has no problem putting points on the board. It's just, you know, I don't think South Alabama has enough to pull off the upset, But I could see it being a little uncomfortable in the second half for LSU, where maybe you're still winning by multiple touchdowns, which I would expect, but you're giving up 30, 40 plus points to a group of 5 team. That's not going to sit super well with the fan base. And as you said, you just lost your best player, Harold Perkins, to an ACL tear. But so it goes in the world of college football.
Absolutely. And that wraps up the JOX Countdown to Kickoff presented by our friends at Dread River. You got to get down there. Listen, 2400 7th Avenue South in Birmingham. They've got everything that you want. Look at we have the examples right here. And my mouth is starting to water a little bit just trying to see what's on tap. They're at Dread River, and we appreciate them. And for Conrad, for Molly, I'm Damian. We'll see you next week on JOX Countdown to Kickoff presented by Dread River here on JOX 94.5.